My father retired and demanded that I pay him $6,000 monthly. One day, I found out that he was gambling at the casino, while my brothers paid him nothing, yet I was forced to do it. Hey Reddit, I'm Jack. I'm 35, work in IT, and have been pretty content with my life. I've got a spacious house, a great career, and the freedom to live how I want. At least, that's how things were before my dad, Tom, threw a wrench into everything. Last month, during a family dinner, my dad casually announced he was retiring early. He's 63 and has worked in construction his whole life, so I could understand him being tired. But what caught me off guard was what he said next. He expected me to take care of him financially while he figured things out. His monthly expenses were over $6,000. The room went quiet. My sister, Mia, stared at her plate, avoiding eye contact. My older brother, Ryan, let out an awkward laugh, clearly hoping this was some kind of joke. I asked him if he was serious, and he looked me dead in the eye and said, "Of course. You're the one in the best position to help." I felt like I'd been slapped. Sure, I make a decent living, but $6,000 a month? That's not a small ask. It's a huge financial burden. I suggested maybe he could downsize or find a part-time job to ease the load. He shot the idea down immediately, saying he was too old to work anymore and that selling his house wasn't an option. The house, he claimed, was his legacy. The so-called legacy he's clinging to isn't even worth saving. It's a half-renovated money pit drowning in debt. He's taken out a second mortgage and maxed out credit cards to improve it, but it's far from finished. I tried to reason with him, but he was adamant. He even had the audacity to say, "I've worked hard my whole life, Jack. Now it's your turn to step up for the family." After dinner, I tried talking to Mia. She's 29, a teacher, and barely scraping by herself. She said it wasn't fair to put everything on me, but we both knew Dad wouldn't listen to anyone else. When I brought it up with Ryan, he just shrugged and said, "I'd help if I could, but I'm barely keeping my head above water. Maybe you can handle it for a bit?" I felt completely alone. Ryan's always been unreliable. He jumps from one odd job to another and never seems to get his life together. Mia's kind-hearted but broke. That left me as the successful sibling expected to clean up Dad's mess. I started digging into his finances to see just how bad things were. It was worse than I imagined. He wasn't just in debt, he was drowning in it. The credit cards were maxed out, and the second mortgage payments were staggering. He had medical bills from a knee surgery he never told us about. On top of that, his monthly expenses weren't even basic necessities. He was paying for premium cable, a fancy car lease, and eating out several times a week. When I brought up cutting back, he exploded. He said he couldn't live without his comforts and that I had no right to tell him how to spend his money. He even threw in a jab about me being just like my mother, which stung. My mom left him when I was 12, and honestly, I don't blame her. His financial recklessness and refusal to change drove her away. Realizing I couldn't handle this alone, I consulted a financial advisor. I laid everything out: his debts, his refusal to downsize, his excessive spending. The advisor didn't sugarcoat it. She said there was no way to sustain his lifestyle without significant changes, and if I stepped in, I'd be risking my own financial stability. Armed with that information, I confronted him again. This time, I came prepared with a detailed breakdown of his expenses and debts. I explained that if he wanted my help, he'd need to make some compromises, like selling the house, cutting unnecessary expenses, and maybe picking up part-time work. He was furious. He accused me of turning my back on him, saying, "After everything I've done for you, this is how you repay me." I tried to stay calm and explain that it wasn't about abandoning him but being realistic. There was no way I could support him at this level indefinitely. Then he dropped a bombshell. He said, "You don't get it, do you? I co-signed your student loans. You wouldn't even have your fancy IT job if it weren't for me." My head spun. I'd paid off my loans years ago and never needed a co-signer. What was he talking about? He went on to say he took out loans to cover family expenses while I was in college. Loans I knew nothing about. It felt like the floor had been ripped out from under me. Not only was he trying to guilt-trip me into bailing him out, but now he was tying his debt to my education. I demanded to see the loan documents, but he refused, claiming it was none of my business. When I told my dad I couldn't finance his lifestyle, the fallout was worse than I could have imagined. I thought he might be disappointed, maybe even angry, but I didn't expect him to make it a family-wide issue. Somehow, he managed to drag nearly every relative we have into the mess. It started with me saying, "No," I told him, calmly but firmly, that I had my own life and responsibilities. I explained that my financial advisor said it wasn't feasible and that even if I wanted to help, $6,000 a month was simply too much. I didn't even get to finish before he cut me off. "You're selfish, Jack. Absolutely selfish. Everything I've done for you. And this is how you repay me." He was shouting now, his face red and his voice shaking with anger. I tried to keep my cool. "This isn't about being selfish, Dad. It's about being realistic. I'm not a bank, and I can't sacrifice my entire future because you don't want to make any changes." That didn't sit well with him. He stormed out of my house, slamming the door so hard that one of my picture frames fell off the wall. I thought that was the end of it, just a heated argument we'd eventually get over. But I underestimated how far he was willing to go to prove his point. The next day, I got a call from Uncle Greg. He's my dad's younger brother, the self-appointed voice of reason in the family. He started off friendly enough, asking how I was doing, but it didn't take long for him to get to the real reason for the call. "Jack, I heard about the situation with your dad. I have to say, I'm a little disappointed." I blinked, caught off guard. "Disappointed? Why?" "Well, you've always been the successful one in the family. It just seems ungrateful not to help him out, you know? He's your father." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. "Greg, you know as well as I do that Dad's been irresponsible with money his whole life. This isn't about me being ungrateful. It's about him refusing to take responsibility." Greg sighed like he was talking to a child who just didn't get it. "Look, I'm not saying he's perfect, but family's family. Sometimes you've got to step up, even when it's hard." The conversation ended with him basically telling me to think about it. I thought that was bad enough, but it was just the beginning. Over the next week, I started getting calls and texts from other relatives, cousins, aunts, even people I hadn't spoken to in years. Cousin Rachel, who lives 3 states away and barely knows me, sent me a long Facebook message about family duty. Aunt Carol, who's always been a busybody, called to lecture me on respecting my elders. Even my cousin Josh, who still lives with his parents at 28, chimed in with his 2 cents. The worst part was that none of them seemed to care about the actual numbers. I tried explaining that I couldn't afford $6,000 a month, but it was like talking to a brick wall. They just kept parroting the same lines. "He's your dad, family comes first, and you're the only one who can help." It didn't take long for my dad to catch wind of my refusal to help. He called me a few days later, and the conversation was nothing short of a disaster. "You've turned the whole family against me," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "What were you thinking, dragging everyone into this?" "What was I thinking?" he shot back. "I was thinking that maybe they could knock some sense into you. You're the one who's supposed to take care of me. It's your duty as my son." I took a deep breath. "Dad, I'm not responsible for cleaning up your messes. You've been reckless with money for decades, and now you expect me to fix everything without making any sacrifices yourself? That's not fair." "Fair?" he barked. "Life isn't fair, Jack. You think it was fair when I broke my back working construction, so you could have a roof over your head?" This went on for nearly an hour. By the end of it, I was emotionally drained and no closer to getting through to him. He was convinced I was the bad guy, and now half the family thought so too. The only person who didn't take a side was my mom, Linda. She left my dad years ago, and while they've barely spoken since, she somehow got wind of the drama. I called her, hoping for some advice or at least a sympathetic ear. "Mom, what do you think I should do?" I asked. She sighed heavily. "Jack, I'm not going to tell you what to do. This is between you and your father." Her neutrality stung more than I expected. I wanted her to tell me I was doing the right thing, to back me up, but she wouldn't. "I understand why you feel the way you do," she said. "And I understand why he feels the way he does. You'll have to figure this out on your own." It wasn't just my relatives who were piling on the pressure. My dad started spreading rumors about me to his friends. I found out when one of his old drinking buddies, Frank, cornered me at a family barbecue. "Jack, I don't know how you can sleep at night, leaving your old man high and dry like that," Frank said, his breath reeking of beer. I stared at him, dumbfounded. "Excuse me? He's told us everything. You're rolling in money, living in that big house, and you can't spare a dime for your father? Shameful." I wanted to scream. Instead, I just walked away. It wasn't worth the argument. The stress started taking a toll on me. I found myself snapping at coworkers and losing focus at work. Even my friends noticed something was wrong. My best friend, Ethan, finally cornered me one night after I bailed on plans for the third time in a row. "Jack, what's going on?" he asked. "You've been acting like a ghost lately." I told him everything. By the time I finished, he looked more angry than I felt. "That's insane," he said. "You don't owe your dad anything. He's a grown man who made his own choices. Don't let him drag you down with him." It was good to hear someone say it out loud, but it didn't make the situation any easier. I was stuck between standing my ground and being vilified by my family. The guilt was crushing, but so was the thought of giving in and sacrificing everything I'd worked for. As the weeks went on, the tension only grew. Family gatherings became unbearable. My dad would make snide comments under his breath, loud enough for everyone to hear. "Must be nice to have money and not share it," he'd mutter, glaring at me. The relatives who sided with him would chime in with passive-aggressive remarks. "Not everyone's lucky enough to have a tech job," Cousin Rachel said at one point. "Some of us have to take care of our parents." I felt like an outcast in my own family. No matter what I said or did, they refused to see my side. My dad was their victim, and I was the villain. The worst part was knowing that this wasn't just about money. It was about control. My dad didn't just want financial support. He wanted me to fall in line, to take on the role he thought I owed him. But I couldn't. No matter how much it hurt, I knew I had to stand my ground. If I gave in now, it would never end. My dad would keep taking, keep demanding, until there was nothing left of the life I'd built. And I wasn't willing to let that happen. The fallout from refusing to support my dad financially didn't just linger, it escalated. Tom, my father, doubled down on painting me as the villain, telling anyone who would listen that I'd betrayed the family. What started as a tense disagreement between us soon became an all-out family war. I found out how far he was willing to go when my Aunt Sharon called me one evening. I picked up, already wary after weeks of hostile messages from other relatives. "Jack, I'm so disappointed in you," she began without even a greeting. Her tone was dripping with judgment. "What now?" I asked, trying to sound calm but already dreading the conversation. "Your father told me everything. How you refused to help him when he needed you most. After all he's done for you. I can't believe you'd be so ungrateful." I let out a bitter laugh. "Sharon, do you even know the full story? Or are you just repeating what he told you?" She didn't answer that. Instead, she launched into a tirade about how family sticks together and how my dad had sacrificed so much for me growing up. It was the same script I'd heard from everyone else. "Look," I said, cutting her off. "I'm not refusing to help because I don't care. I'm refusing because I literally can't afford to support him at the level he expects. He's not willing to make any sacrifices or changes, and that's not fair to me." "Well," she snapped, "if you cared about your father, you'd find a way." That was the turning point for me. It became clear that no matter what I said, some people weren't interested in hearing my side. My dad had painted me as the selfish, ungrateful son, and they were happy to believe it. Meanwhile, my brother Michael tried to step in. Michael, at 31, works in marketing and has always been the fixer in the family. He's the type to avoid conflict at all costs, so when he heard about the situation, his first instinct was to smooth things over. "I'll help," he told me during one of our rare phone calls. "Maybe if we both pitch in, it won't be so overwhelming." "Michael, no," I said firmly. "You've got your own issues. I know you're still paying off student loans. Don't put yourself in a hole trying to bail him out." But Michael wouldn't listen. He insisted he could manage and that it was the least he could do as Dad's son. A week later, I found out he'd given Dad $1,500 to cover some overdue bills. At first, Dad was thrilled. He even called me to gloat about how at least one of my sons understands family loyalty, But it didn't take long for Michael to realize he'd made a mistake. 2 weeks later, he called me in a panic. "Jack, I messed up," he admitted. "I thought I could handle helping Dad, but now I'm behind on my own credit card payments. And he's already asking for more." I wasn't surprised. "Michael, I tried to warn you. He'll take as much as you're willing to give, and then he'll ask for more." "What do I do?" he asked, sounding genuinely desperate. "You tell him no," I said. "It's the only way. Trust me, I've been there." Michael promised he'd set boundaries, but I wasn't convinced. He's always had a hard time standing up to Dad, and I could tell this was no different. Sure enough, a few days later, Dad called me to complain about how Michael's not stepping up anymore. It was like he couldn't even process the idea that we had our own lives and responsibilities. While all this was happening, my sister Jessica tried to stay out of the fray. Jessica is 28 and works as a nurse. She's practical, no nonsense, and fiercely independent. Out of all of us, she's the one who inherited Mom's stubbornness. "Jack, for what it's worth, I think you're doing the right thing," she told me one afternoon when we met for coffee. "Dad's always been manipulative, and it's about time someone called him out on it." "Thanks," I said, grateful for the support. "But it feels like I'm fighting the entire family at this point." She nodded sympathetically. "I get it. That's why I'm staying out of it. I can't afford to get dragged into this mess. It's toxic." I didn't blame her for keeping her distance, but it still stung a little. I felt like I was standing on an island, with my dad and half the family on one side and me on the other. Michael was stuck in the middle, torn between trying to help and protecting himself, and Jessica was keeping a safe distance. Dad's campaign against me didn't stop at the family, either. He started telling his friends and neighbors about my betrayal, twisting the story to make himself look like the victim. One day, I ran into Mr. Patterson, the retired guy who lives down the street from Dad. He gave me a disapproving look and said, "Your father deserves better, Jack. I hope you can live with yourself." I was floored. My dad had taken his pity party so far that even his neighbors were weighing in. It was surreal. At work, I was struggling to focus. The constant stress and family drama were wearing me down. My boss, Karen, even pulled me aside one day to ask if everything was okay. "You've seemed distracted lately," she said gently. "Is there something going on?" I hesitated, not wanting to air my dirty laundry at work. "Just some family stuff," I said vaguely. "I'm handling it." But the truth was, I wasn't handling it. I was barely keeping my head above water. Every time my phone buzzed, I braced myself for another guilt trip or angry message. It felt like I was fighting a battle I couldn't win. Then came the breaking point. My dad showed up at my house unannounced one evening. I opened the door to find him standing there with a box of old photo albums and a bottle of whiskey. "What's this?" I asked, already dreading whatever he was about to say. "I thought we could look through some memories," he said, pushing past me into the house. "Maybe remind you of everything I've done for you." I stood there, stunned. He wasn't here to have a genuine conversation. He was here to guilt me into submission. He spent the next hour flipping through photos and reminiscing about all the sacrifices he'd made for me growing up. Every story was laced with subtle and not so subtle digs about how I was failing him now. When he finally left, I felt drained and defeated. No matter how many times I said no, he just kept pushing. And the more he pushed, the more isolated I felt. It was like he was determined to break me down, one way or another. Jessica called me the next day to check in. "How are you holding up?" she asked. "Honestly, not great," I admitted. "I feel like I'm losing my mind." "You're not," she said firmly. "You're doing the right thing, Jack. Don't let him wear you down." Her words were a small comfort, but they didn't change the reality of the situation. My dad was relentless, and the pressure from the rest of the family wasn't letting up. I didn't know how much longer I could keep fighting this battle, but I knew one thing for sure. I couldn't give in. Not now, and not ever. I didn't think my relationship with my father could get any worse, but I was wrong. Just when I thought I had a handle on the chaos, my mom, Linda, dropped a bombshell that shook me to my core. It started on a Saturday afternoon when she called me out of the blue. Mom and I don't talk often. Her divorce from Dad left a lingering bitterness, and she tends to stay out of family drama. So when she asked if I could come by her place, I knew it wasn't just a casual visit. When I arrived, she greeted me with a hug that felt heavier than usual, like she was bracing herself for something difficult. We sat down at her kitchen table, and she poured us both a cup of coffee before she began. "Jack," she said, her voice low and hesitant, "there's something you need to know about your father." I leaned back in my chair, already on edge. If this is about him being mad at me, I already know. He's told half the family I'm a monster. She shook her head. It's not about that. It's about his finances, and the real reason he's in this mess. My stomach churned. I'd spent weeks unraveling his debts, trying to make sense of how he'd managed to dig himself such a deep hole. I thought I knew everything. Apparently, I was wrong. "Your father has a gambling problem," she said bluntly. I froze. "What?" She sighed, looking down at her coffee cup. "It started decades ago, back when we were still married. He was always chasing the next big win, convinced he'd hit the jackpot and solve all our problems. At first, it was small, poker games with friends, occasional trips to the casino. But it got worse. A lot worse." I stared at her, trying to process what she was saying. "Why didn't you tell me?" "I wanted to," she said, her voice trembling. "But I didn't know how. And after we divorced, I thought it wasn't my place anymore. I thought he'd stopped, or at least slowed down. But clearly, he hasn't." As she spoke, pieces of the puzzle started falling into place. The constant debt, the mysterious, unexpected expenses, the way he always seemed to be waiting for a miracle to fix everything. It all made sense now. But what she said next was what truly shattered me. "There's more," she said, hesitating. "When you were in high school, your father, he took money from your college fund to pay off one of his gambling debts." I felt like the air had been sucked out of the room. "He what?" "It was supposed to be a loan," she said quickly, as if that made it better. "He promised he'd pay it back, but of course, he never did." My hands clenched into fists. All those years I'd worked part-time jobs, scrimping and saving to cover my tuition because I thought we didn't have any money. I'd gone into debt myself, believing that was the only option. And all along, the money was there, until my father gambled it away. "I can't believe this," I said, my voice shaking with anger. "Why didn't you stop him?" "I tried," she said, tears welling up in her eyes. "But you know how he is. He wouldn't listen. And by the time I found out, the money was already gone." I stood up, pacing the kitchen. "He lied to me. Both of you lied to me. I've spent years blaming myself, thinking I didn't work hard enough, didn't save enough, and all this time, he was stealing from me." "I'm sorry, Jack," she said softly. "I should have told you sooner. But I thought it would only make things worse." Her apology didn't feel like enough. My trust in my parents was already fragile after everything that had happened. But this was a betrayal I didn't know if I could ever forgive. Later that night, I confronted my dad. I didn't even call first. I just showed up at his house, too angry to wait. He opened the door, looking annoyed. "What do you want now?" "I want the truth," I said, stepping inside. "Mom told me everything. About the gambling. About the college fund. I want to hear it from you." His face paled for a moment, but then he tried to play it off. "She doesn't know what she's talking about." "Don't lie to me," I snapped. "Just admit it," he sighed, running a hand through his hair. "Fine. Yes, I took some money from the fund, but I didn't have a choice. I was in a tough spot." "A tough spot?" I echoed, my voice rising. "You were gambling, Dad. You stole from your own son to pay off your debts." "It wasn't stealing," he said defensively. "It was my money too. And I did it for the family." "For the family?" I said, incredulous. "You mean for yourself? Don't try to twist this into something noble. You've been lying and manipulating everyone for years." He crossed his arms, his expression hardening. "I don't have to explain myself to you. You think you're so much better than me, but you have no idea what it's like to carry the weight of this family." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. Even now, faced with the truth, he was still trying to play the victim. I turned and walked out, slamming the door behind me. I couldn't stand to be in the same room as him anymore. Over the next few days, I tried to make sense of everything. The more I thought about it, the angrier I got. I'd worked so hard to build a stable life for myself, only to find out that my own father had sabotaged me behind my back. It wasn't just the money. It was the lies, the betrayal, the complete lack of accountability. Jessica called me after hearing about the confrontation. "Are you okay?" she asked. "No," I said bluntly. "I feel like my whole childhood was a lie." "I'm so sorry, Jack," she said. "I wish there was something I could do." Her support meant a lot, but it didn't change the fact that I was now questioning everything. If Dad had been lying about this, what else had he hidden from us? How much of my life had been shaped by his mistakes? Michael, meanwhile, was still trying to process the news himself. "I had no idea," he said when we talked. "I knew Dad wasn't great with money, but gambling? That's a whole other level." "He's been playing us for years," I said. "And the worst part is, he doesn't even feel bad about it." Michael sighed. "What do we do now?" "I don't know," I admitted, "but I'm done trying to fix his problems. He made this mess. He can live with the consequences." As the days went on, I realized that my relationship with my dad might never recover. He'd spent years manipulating and lying to everyone around him, and now that the truth was out, I couldn't see a way forward. It was a painful realization, but it also felt like a weight had been lifted. For the first time in a long time, I wasn't carrying his burdens anymore. And that, at least, was something. After the bombshell about my dad's gambling problem and his theft of my college fund, I knew I had to take control of the situation. Trusting him, or anyone else in my family to some extent, felt like a gamble I couldn't afford anymore. The first thing I did was schedule a consultation with a lawyer. I found someone local, an older guy named Mr. Lewis, who specialized in financial and family law. Sitting in his office, I laid everything out. My dad's debts, his manipulation, the family infighting, and the revelation about the college fund. "You did the right thing coming here," Mr. Lewis said, adjusting his glasses as he flipped through the notes he'd taken. "This is a complicated situation, but there are steps we can take to protect you." The first thing he recommended was freezing my credit. I hadn't even thought of that, but it made sense. With how reckless and manipulative my dad was, I couldn't risk him taking out loans in my name or doing something equally catastrophic. Mr. Lewis also advised me to check my financial accounts regularly for any suspicious activity. "The most important thing," he said, "is to create a clear boundary. If he tries to manipulate you again, you need to make it clear that you won't tolerate it." I nodded, but the idea of cutting him off completely felt daunting. Despite everything, he was still my dad. There was a part of me that wanted to believe he could change, that he could take responsibility and make amends. But deep down, I knew that wasn't realistic. When I got home, I immediately started taking Mr. Lewis's advice. Freezing my credit was surprisingly easy. It only took a few minutes online. I also set up alerts on all my bank accounts and credit cards so I'd know instantly if there was any suspicious activity. It felt good to take control, but it also made me realize how vulnerable I'd been before. A few days later, my dad called. I'd been avoiding his calls since our last confrontation, but this time, I decided to pick up. Maybe it was morbid curiosity, or maybe I just wanted to see if he'd finally admit he was wrong. Spoiler alert, he didn't. "Jack," he said, his tone dripping with false cheer, "I've been thinking about what you said, and I think we can work something out." I sighed, already exhausted. "What do you want, Dad?" "Look, I know I've made some mistakes," he began, "but I'm willing to meet you halfway. How about this? You cover half my expenses for now, and I'll figure out the rest." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. After everything he'd done, stealing my college fund, lying to me, manipulating the family, he still thought I'd be willing to bail him out. "Dad," I said, trying to keep my voice steady, "the answer is no. I'm not covering your expenses. Not half, not a quarter, not a dime." His tone changed instantly. The fake cheerfulness vanished, replaced by anger. "You're really going to leave me out in the cold? After everything I've done for you?" I laughed bitterly. "What have you done for me, Dad? Besides steal from me and lie to me?" "I raised you," he snapped. "I put a roof over your head and food on the table. Is this how you repay me?" "Raising me was your responsibility," I shot back. "It wasn't a favor you did so you could cash in later. And by the way, stealing my college fund doesn't exactly scream Father of the Year," he started yelling, but I hung up before he could finish. I was done arguing with him. After that call, I blocked his number, along with his social media accounts and email. It felt harsh, but it also felt necessary. Every interaction with him only brought more stress and pain, and I couldn't keep putting myself through it. Blocking him wasn't the end of the drama, though. A week later, I got a call from my cousin Rachel. She's one of the relatives who'd been siding with my dad throughout all of this, and I hadn't spoken to her in weeks. "Jack," she said, her tone accusatory, "I can't believe you blocked your own father. Do you have any idea how hurt he is?" I rolled my eyes. "Rachel, do you have any idea what he's done? Or are you just taking his word for everything?" "He told me you're abandoning him," she said, "that you've turned your back on the family." I couldn't help but laugh. Of course he said that. Did he also mention that he stole my college fund? Or that he's been lying and manipulating everyone for years? There was a long pause. "He said he borrowed the money," she said weakly. "Borrowed?" I repeated, incredulous. "Did he also tell you that he never paid it back? Or that he's still gambling?" "Wake up, Rachel. He's using you, just like he's used everyone else." She didn't have much to say after that. It was clear she didn't want to believe me, but the cracks in her loyalty to my dad were starting to show. It felt like a small victory, but it didn't make the situation any less exhausting. Around this time, I also started seeing a therapist. Between the family drama and the stress of dealing with my dad, I felt like I was barely holding it together. My therapist, Dr. Grant, was a calm, steady presence in the chaos. She helped me process my anger and guilt and gave me tools to set boundaries and protect myself. One of the most important things she told me was that it was okay to let go. "You can love someone and still decide they're not healthy to have in your life," she said. "Setting boundaries isn't cruel, it's self-preservation." That advice stuck with me. For so long, I'd felt guilty about cutting my dad off, like it made me a bad son or a bad person. But hearing Dr. Grant say it was okay gave me the permission I needed to move forward. The final straw came a few weeks later, when my dad tried one last desperate tactic. He sent me a letter, an actual, handwritten letter, begging for forgiveness. At first, I thought maybe he'd finally taken responsibility for his actions. But as I read it, my hope turned to disgust. The letter wasn't an apology. It was a guilt trip. He listed every sacrifice he'd ever made for me, exaggerated or outright fabricated, and ended by saying, "If you don't help me, you'll regret it for the rest of your life." I tore the letter in half and threw it in the trash. That was it. I was done. With my therapist's help, I wrote my dad a letter of my own. It wasn't emotional or accusatory. It was just a statement of facts. I explained that I couldn't continue our relationship unless he sought professional help for his gambling problem and took full responsibility for the harm he'd caused. Until then, I wouldn't be in contact with him. I never sent the letter. I realized I didn't owe him an explanation or an opportunity to manipulate me further. Instead, I kept it for myself as a reminder of why I'd made the decision to cut him off. Life hasn't been easy since then, but it's been quieter. Without my dad's constant demands and drama, I've been able to focus on my own well-being. It's not the ending I wanted, but it's the one I needed. And for the first time in a long time, I feel free. It had been weeks since I'd blocked my dad on every platform, and I was starting to feel like I could breathe again. The quiet was unnerving at first, but I was finally able to focus on my own life without constantly looking over my shoulder for the next crisis he'd throw at me. Then, one Saturday afternoon, everything unraveled. I was in the kitchen making lunch when I heard banging on my front door. Not knocking, banging, like someone was trying to break it down. My stomach dropped. I wasn't expecting anyone, and the force of it made me instantly suspicious. I walked to the door, looked through the peephole, and saw my dad standing there, his face red with fury. I didn't want to open the door, but before I could decide, he started yelling, "Jack, open this door right now. I know you're in there." His voice was loud enough to wake the whole neighborhood. I cracked the door open just enough to talk to him. "What the hell are you doing here, Dad?" He pushed against the door, trying to force his way in, but I held my ground. "We need to talk," he said, his voice trembling with anger. "You're not going to shut me out like this." There's nothing to talk about, I said, keeping my tone as calm as I could. You need to leave. Instead of backing down, he launched into a tirade. You've destroyed this family, Jack. All I ever wanted was a little help, and you've turned everyone against me. You're selfish, ungrateful, a disgrace. I felt my temper rising, but I knew better than to argue with him. I'm not doing this, I said. Leave, or I'll call the police. You'd call the cops on your own father? He shouted, his voice dripping with mock disbelief. Go ahead, Jack. Show everyone what kind of son you really are. That was the last straw. I stepped back, closed the door, and locked it. Then I grabbed my phone and dialed 911. As I explained the situation to the dispatcher, I could still hear him shouting outside, calling me every name in the book. The police arrived within 10 minutes. By the time they got there, my dad had moved to pacing on the front lawn, muttering to himself. When the officers approached him, he started yelling about how I was a terrible son who'd abandoned him. They didn't seem particularly interested in his sob story. One of the officers knocked on my door, and I stepped outside to explain. This is my father, I said. He showed up unannounced and refused to leave. I've already asked him multiple times. Do you want to press charges for trespassing? The officer asked. I hesitated. As much as I wanted to be done with him, pressing charges felt like a step too far. No, I said finally. I just want him to leave. The officers escorted my dad off my property, warning him that if he came back, he'd be arrested. As he left, he shot me one last look, a mix of anger and desperation. It was hard to tell if he was genuinely hurt or just angry he didn't get his way. That night, he started leaving me voicemails. At first, they were angry, accusing me of being heartless and cruel. But as the days went on, they turned tearful. He begged for forgiveness, claimed he was sorry, and promised to change. I didn't listen to most of them. I deleted them without responding. A week later, something good finally happened. My boss called me into her office for a meeting. I assumed it was just another routine check-in, but instead, she handed me a letter with my name on it. Jack, you've been doing excellent work, she said, smiling. We've decided to promote you to senior project manager. Congratulations. I stared at her, stunned. Thank you. I managed to say, this is wow. The promotion came with a hefty pay raise. My new salary would be over $200,000 a year. For the first time in months, I felt like I was winning. The timing couldn't have been better. I needed something good to focus on, and this was exactly the boost I needed. When I called my sister Jessica to tell her the news, she was genuinely happy for me. You deserve it, she said. After everything you've been through, it's about time something went your way. Jessica and I had grown closer since the family drama started. She was one of the few people who truly understood what I was dealing with, and she'd been my rock through all of it. We started talking more regularly, checking in on each other and offering support whenever we could. One evening, over dinner, she said, have you ever thought about moving? Starting fresh somewhere else? The idea had crossed my mind, but I hadn't seriously considered it until then. Maybe, I said. I've been thinking about a job opening at one of our offices in New Haven. It's about 300 miles away. She nodded. That could be good for you. A clean slate. The more I thought about it, the more appealing it sounded. Moving to a new city, far away from the family drama, felt like the fresh start I desperately needed. While I was making plans to move, my mom, Linda, surprised me. She called one evening and said, I've been thinking a lot about everything that's happened. I need to start taking responsibility for my own life. She explained that she'd gotten a part-time job at a local boutique and was planning to move in with her sister, Aunt Kathy, until she could afford her own place. It was a big step for her. She'd spent years relying on alimony and avoiding work. Seeing her take action was inspiring. That's great, Mom, I said. I'm proud of you. Thanks, Jack, she said. And I just want you to know, I'm sorry for everything. For not telling you about the college fund, for not stepping in when your dad went too far. I should have done more. Her apology felt genuine, and for the first time in a long time, I felt a sense of closure. It didn't erase the past, but it was a step in the right direction. As for me, I started house hunting in New Haven. I found a beautiful place just outside the city, a modern, three-bedroom house with plenty of space and a big backyard. It felt like the perfect place to start over. Moving day was bittersweet. Leaving behind the place where I'd built my life wasn't easy, but I knew it was the right decision. Jessica helped me pack, and as we loaded the last box into the moving truck, she gave me a hug. "You're going to do great," she said. "This is the fresh start you need." Driving away from my old life, I felt a mix of sadness and relief. The past year had been one of the hardest of my life, but it had also taught me a lot about resilience, boundaries, and the importance of taking care of myself. As I settled into my new home, I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time: hope. For the first time in years, I was in control of my life, free from the drama and toxicity that had weighed me down for so long. The road ahead wasn't going to be easy, but for the first time, I felt ready to face it.